The year is 1950. Ernie is a young man. He goes into Ancaster, New Brunswick. He holds up the bank. He terrifies the cashier. The bank manager runs into his office, grabs his gun out of his desk, and runs out shooting at Ernie as he was running down the street. But fortunately, he didn't hit him because he's left his eyeglasses on his desk. Of course, Doris, the teller that was so terrified, she was a Christian, and she started to pray, and she prayed for Ernie for 25 years. She prayed that somebody would give Ernie a Bible, take a special interest in him, and that his life would be changed. It was only in 1980 that she got to meet Ernie because she was a volunteer in the Halifax Correctional Centre, and Ernie came in to speak in the chapel. So you see, sometimes we don't know what that little prayer is doing for all those 25 years. And when she met Ernie, he wasn't a bank robber anymore. He now is a changed man. Between 1950 and 1973, Ernie was in and out of prison. He was being institutionalized. So between 1950 and 1973, Ernie was going in and out of prison here in Canada. And he was just becoming institutionalized. But he escaped across the border, and down he went to California. And of course, you know, he's still got to eat. So he went into the supermarket to help himself to some food. And as he was going towards the front of the store, a off-duty police officer happened to catch the gun in his belt. And so he walked up and he grabbed for the gun, and Ernie grabbed for the gun, and they fell to the floor and were rolling on the floor, and the gun went off, and it happened to just graze the skin on the police officer's leg. Of course, he was taken into custody, and then they offered him a deal. They said, if you will plead guilty to attempted murder of a police officer, we will give you a 1-year sentence. That was too good a deal to pass up. So Ernie accepted that, and he went and he spent that 1 year in the LA County Jail. And he said that was the worst time he ever served, because he said you never knew if you were going to wake up the next morning. The racial tension was just so high in that place. He sure was pleased to get out of there at the end of the 1 year. Ernie returned to Canada, and they put him in Millhaven prison, and that was the newest electronic prison that they figured he couldn't escape from. And he just institutionalized, settled in to do his time, and he started tying fish flies. And he tied 84,000 fish flies in that period of time. The guys on the cell range really had fun with him, and they put a big sign on his cell, and it said, "Time flies, time flies." And, you know, they still got humor, even although they're inside there. He had a mail order business going, and he sent out samples to people. He sent this box of fish flies to Pembroke, to Grant Bailey, who had this Bailey sporting goods store, and never heard from him. He just probably thought it was one of those ones that had gone out the window. But during that period of time, it just sat on Grant Bailey's desk. And then he wrote about 3 months later. He didn't get too many letters. Oh, he was really pleased, and it was a bright spot in his day. But then, as he read it, and this man was going on about God, he didn't want anything to do with that. But he did want the fish fly order, so he decided he would correspond with this man. And that is how it all started. The friendship grew over the next 18 months, as Grant Bailey would drive 3 hours down, visit him for an hour, and drive 3 hours back. And he did that for 18 months. He gave Ernie a Bible, and he took a special interest in him and kept praying for him. He asked him to check out all that he was telling him in that Bible. Ernie checked out those things in the Bible, just like Grant asked him to. And on March the 12th, 1975, he decided to make a decision. And he asked Christ into his life. And he just said to the Lord, "I'm tired and sick of this cockroach life that I've lived. Forgive me of all my sins, and come into my life and give me a brand new start, just like you did for Grant." The Lord appeared to him in his cell. He touched Ernie on his shoulder, and he said, "Your slate is now wiped clean. I'm so glad you didn't kill that police officer. You can start all over again. Your life is completely new. Your slate is clean." And as he read his Bible, he kept on seeing more and more changes occurring in his life. This was for real. And then he was released from prison. years before his time was up. The date is April the 14th, 1976, and Grant Bailey comes to transport Ernie and all his fish flies from the prison, and they pack them in the back of the station wagon car and head towards Pembroke to Grant Bailey's home. And he is given a room in Grant Bailey's home. He is also offered employment immediately at Grant Bailey's sporting goods store. Can you just imagine that, with all those guns and rifles? Ernie started doing speaking engagements even while he was working at the sporting goods store. He went to the Scouts. He'd show a display of his fish flies, weave his story around it. He'd also go to Rotary clubs, Optimist clubs, schools, and then weave his story about being a bank robber to now being a productive person in the community. An article was written about Ernie, and it was called Caught with My Own Hook, and it just summarized his whole life. And it was put into a magazine that went across Canada to all the churches. So before you knew it, there were people writing for speaking engagements. And so Ernie started to speak to many, many churches all across Canada. Ernie received an invitation to go and speak on the TV. It was called Crossroads, and it was the host was David Maines. And so George and Grant Bailey, two men from Pembroke, drove him down, and he went on the program and shared his story, and in his usual very animated way. This man, George Foss, took a special interest in Ernie, and he saw his interest that Ernie had for the street children in Pembroke. And George provided a drop-in centre for the street children of Pembroke, and Ernie started to work with children off the street. I think this was wonderful because it helped him where he had gone wrong as a young person. And here he was trying to redirect these lives off of the street. And later on in the summer, he even had a Share Christ camp for those same street children on the banks of the Ottawa River. When Ernie got out of prison, he realized that he had wasted too many years in prison, and it was a little bit too late to start his own family. And he asked the Lord in prayer, Lord, give me a ready-made family. And God gave him exactly that on the 17th of December in 1977. And here is Ernie and I with our ready-made family. And the children are 5, 3, and 18 months now. But the baby was only 4 months when I was widowed. So God gave him his answer, and we are happily married. 4 months after our marriage, Ernie says, we're going to go back to Millhaven, and I want you to come with me and bring the family. And I thought, well, this is different. But anyway, he says, I have a friend down there, and he said, I want you to meet him. And his name's Jim. And so we went to Millhaven, and we went in and we spoke to Jim through the glass. And actually the children sang Jesus Loves Me to him. And they even went up and blew kisses to him through the glass. We don't know what that means to somebody inside who has not had any love shown to them through the years. Ernie went back a little time later and said to Jim, I'm going to Bermuda. I'm going to be speaking to the men down there in the prison. Would you pray for me? And Jim, being a solid con, said, yes, I will. And he did. And he started to pray. He opened lines of communication with God. And that was the key to bringing Jim to a new faith in Christ too. Here is Jim, just weeks after he gave his life to the Lord. Just look how it's even changed his face. 3 years later, God blessed us, and Joy was born. And Ernie became a father at 50. For those first few years of marriage, I didn't see much of Ernie. He was always away speaking, sharing his story, telling his story. Ernie had no training to do this work. He just got up there, shared what was in his heart, and prayed for the people to have the same experience as he had. And that is exactly how many people came to make their personal commitment to Christ. This was a God thing, and God was changing lives. It wasn't the messenger, but it was the message. Ernie went all across the USA, and he he was actually down there with a businessmen's association called Full Gospel Businessmen. And he would go and speak to these businessmen's luncheons. And they would organize it so that he would do it in a whole state. And they'd have him down there for a week. And then he'd go to another state and they'd have him down there for a week. And then on the weekends, he'd be in churches. So they made use of every time when he was away. And whenever he was there, he would make sure he would go into the local detentions, the local jails, and minister to the men. And of course, he had no trouble relating to them and them to him, because he had sat where they sat. That started that first flow of letters from the prison into our office. And who was there? Sheila. Yes, me. And I've been writing letters ever since. So he crisscrossed across the U.S. He also went to the Caribbean with them because there were other businessmen's meetings there. He went to Cayman Islands. He also, when he went to Bermuda, that was all arranged by them as well. And so he pretty well covered the North America scene. The full gospel was not only in Canada and the U.S., it's all across the world. So the next thing you know, he's heading off to the U.K. Ernie went for a month of a ministry to the UK. It was England, Scotland, and Wales. And he spoke in that 30 days over 30 times. And there again, they would take him into the prisons. In that amount of time, people would give you honorariums. And so he acquired quite an amount of finances. And when he was getting to the end of his journey, he felt wrong about bringing that money out of the country and back to Canada. And so he said to the person who had organized it for him, I want you to keep this amount of money, and I'm going to take home just what I need for my family. And I want you to hold on to this until you find somebody who's doing something for inmates and for street people, and then you can give that money to them. Later, that gentleman gave that money to the Samsons, that was Dave and Di Samson, and they had an outreach for the inmates and for the street people. And they used it when they moved from their smaller residence to a larger residence. Over the years, Ernie spent a month in South Africa and doing exactly the same as he did in the UK. And you can see this is a great big tent where Ernie is speaking to a huge church. And then another place that he went to was New Zealand. I happened to be able to go along with him on this trip because Ernie had enough air miles to get me there free of charge. And so I would be speaking in ladies' groups while he would be speaking in the men's groups and going into the prisons. And so God did give us a little break once in a while, and I was able to travel with Ernie. You will see here Ernie with a policeman and a lawyer. And they are all now converted, and they're all Christians. And of course, you see they're all laughing. Ernie was definitely a prankster. He was tickling them to get them, get them laughing to get this good picture. I was also privileged to go with Ernie to Japan for 10 days. And he was really privileged to go and speak on the U.S. Army base in Japan to the Full Gospel chapter right on the base. But then, of course, we went to the Full Gospel chapters meetings in the various areas of Japan. And it was just wonderful working with the Japanese people. I don't know if you remember that there was this tape age, and Ernie got a duplicating machine. Somebody bought us a duplicating machine, and he would prepare 100 of these when he goes out to speak every weekend. And so we gave away thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of those tapes between 1977 and probably 1987. That was when they were phasing out. And then these inmates' letters start flowing in, and it was just hard to keep up with caring for the family and looking after the maintenance of the house when Ernie was away. But I thank God for people who came in and started to help me with the correspondence coming in from the prisons. We realized that we couldn't stay in Pembroke. It was far too far north. And so we moved to Peterborough, midway between Windsor and Montreal, along the 401 and close to an airport. And so that was where we settled. And we settled in a little townhouse complex when we moved there. And our local church asked Ernie naturally to speak. We got to know a few people in the townhouse complex, so we invited 2 of our neighbour families to come with us that night. That night, both those families, the Bothwells and the Reikleys, made their decision for God. And we have kept in touch with them. On his second trip to the UK, Ernie went to Scotland, and there a Reverend Cameron said to him, "You are letting down your inmate friends." He said, "How many have you seen saved?" And Ernie would say, "Well, I've seen a lot of them give their lives to the Lord when I've been going into the prisons." And he said, "How many do you now see that are staying out?" He said, "You know, you're letting them down. They need a place to come to when they come out. They're just falling back into their old ways." He says, "You need a place where they can transition back into the community." And Ernie saw that. And he said, "I'm going to take care of that when I get home." And so he came back home to me and announced, "We are now going to have a farm for inmates coming out of prison." And he says, "Well, if we're going to have a farm, I better get some directors." So he went out there. He didn't get disciples, he got directors. And he started to look for a location for this farm that he's going to have for these inmates. We went to one community, it was a little village. Oh, they sure chased us out of there with a big community meeting. And so we decided we would better go out to the country. And so we went out to the country and found a nice farmhouse in Indian River. And even there we got a lot of opposition. But it was amazing. After we moved in there, that opposition became quite friendly. They had our men go out and clear rocks off their farm. They also had their children come and ride our horses. Ernie had been invited to go on 100 Huntley Street again before he left for the UK. But now when he comes back, he realizes that the Lord had this all planned. And so now he has a chance to mention his vision of this farm on 100 Huntley Street. He, of course, asked David Mains's permission if he could do that. And so David, who was not building his own kingdom, said, "Yes, you can do that." And Ernie did. And through that, many people responded who saw him on television, and the funds came in for the down payment on the farm. I really believe that God honored Ernie for leaving that money behind in the UK so that they could have a residence in the UK, and then brought him back here and honored him here. And we got the finances just in time to make that down payment on the Hebron farm here in Canada. God is always on time. Right about that same year, it was a busy year in 1982, because that was the year that Ernie's book came out. Ernie's book was made from 10 cassette tapes. He actually knelt down next to the bed and recorded his whole life story on 10 cassette tapes, gave it to Doug Brendel, and Doug Brendel put that book together. He came and listened to Ernie speak, got his whole character, and it really relates in the book. When you consider that the Hooked book over these 40 years have been translated into so many different languages, we know that hundreds, thousands, and even hundreds of thousands could have given their lives to Christ through reading that book. At this lovely farmhouse, as you can see, it's a beautiful place. The Lord gave us a real wonderful house parents. We call them our home parents. And our home parents were Don and Gladys Woodcock. One of their children had been killed in a police chase. So they had had the hardships of family life, and they were the couple that God chose to give us for Hebron Farm. And because of that loss of their son, they were able to speak straight to the men's hearts At this particular residence that we had got, it was classified as a farm, and therefore we were only allowed 3 unrelated persons in the farmhouse, and so that limited us to helping 3 inmates at a time. And that wasn't our plan. We wanted to help more, but it was a good beginning, and it was good to begin in a small way. We had a lot to learn about farming, about inmates, and everything. Even although we could only have a few in at a time, our house parents, Don and Gladys, dealt with them individually. They would work alongside Don, and he could talk to them while he was working, and it would be more accepted than if he was sitting with them lecturing him. And, you know, Gladys, she was a mom at heart, and if they were helping washing the dishes, they got her mouth full too. And so it was living with these men and a family atmosphere, which some of them had never experienced, was getting into their heart. They were realizing the love of these parents, these house parents, that maybe they had never experienced in their own home. And God was breaking down those barriers, and they were responding to the love of God. Of course, David Maines always kept up to date with what Ernie was doing. And of course, he had to check into this farm thing and so he wanted to come down and see the farm for himself. So we said, sure, come on down. And we took a picture outside the barn, and here you can see it, with David and Norma Jean Maines. We were very happy with Hebron Farm, but we longed for a larger residence. And so around about 1986, Ernie was going to again be on 100 Huntley Street. And again, he asked David Maines if he could mention that, yes, we were very happy for the farm that we had, and you've seen what we're doing down there, but our hearts cry out for a larger residence because we want to help more people. And a phone call came in that day, and it was from Elsie Craig, and it was from a Mennonite family who had a 50-acre farm with a large residence on the corner of it, and they would like to rent us this large residence. So Hebron Farm moved to Elsie Craig in June of 1986, just 2 weeks after Ernie's heart surgery. I was leading the convoy, and I didn't know the way, and Ernie was on so much medication still, I had to wake him up and say, which road do I take now? Just as we came across the top of Mississauga. And the person who was driving the truck rental behind us for our house was the person who had given his life to the Lord, Perry Bothwell. About 2 months later, we had the official opening. And we had Grant Bailey and his wife Ethel and the pastor which accepted Ernie into his church when he stepped out of prison, and his wife. And it was Ethel who cut the ribbon, and it was Pastor Earl Young who prayed the dedication prayer for the new farm. Well, at this new farm, it was a very different setup, and we had a drive shed. And so now we had chickens, and we made a section of the drive shed for chickens. We made a section of the drive shed for a woodworking shop, and we had a section of the land where we could put in our garden. So we had a lot of different things at this farm that we didn't have at the other farm. And it was good because we needed that activity for the additional men that would be coming to this farm. It was wonderful to see these men come out and get all dressed up. In those days, you still wore a suit to church. And so we had suits given to us, and these men would be able to get a suit. And actually, in those days, when you came out of prison, you would be given a good outfit as well as a working outfit when you came out of prison. And so they'd have the suit that they would put on for the first Sunday when they would go off to church with us. And it was just amazing to see how these men responded to the love of God. And to the churches, we say a big thank you because they opened their hearts to them. and they accepted them. One thing when a man gets out of prison is he needs a place to go, food to eat, a place to work, which at the beginning we were providing at the farm, but they also needed the acceptance of people. And that's why these churches were such an important thing. And they came out and they helped with the fellowship time at the farm. And these men got to see that Christians could be real people with a real heart that really wanted to help them. Of course, when you have fellowship time at the farm, all sorts of things happen. And here you see, even a marriage was born out of the Hebron farm. And here we see Jeff and Marilyn Landis getting married. Jeff came to us as a Christian from the prison. He was a converted Jewish believer. And here he is getting married to Marilyn. And we just thank God for the wonderful way he puts people together. Right from the beginning, I've been taking care of the administration, so that's 40 years now. I could never have answered all the letters that have been received over this past 40 years. At some times I had 4 or 5 people writing the answers to these letters. And we did it mostly by hand in the beginning, because a guy likes something. He writes to you by hand, and you write back to him by hand. He felt it was personal. They would introduce themselves. I'm writing this on behalf of Ernie. So they knew it wasn't Ernie, but they knew that Ernie wanted them to answer the letter. And it connected them with a caring Christian. And so those letters were answered by many, many people through the years in different places. Some of them were senior citizens sitting in their living room, sitting at the kitchen table. Some of them were sitting in an office. Some were sitting at a typewriter before the computer. And now, of course, I'm typing letters, and I also still handwrite letters. I feel it is much more personal. Another person that I wrote to in the early time there, shortly after writing to Jim, was Cal Mascry. And he is the person with us tonight, and he is the person now that will be taking care of the distribution of the Hebron books. In 1982, he wrote to me shortly after he had given his life to Christ. In 1991, I was concerned with all these prison letters. The only book that I had that was Canadian content was Ernie's book, Hooked. And I said to Ernie, we really need to do something about this. Since you've been out of prison, Jim Kavanagh's given his life to the Lord, Derek Nyman's given his life to the Lord, and these other guys that we've met that have given their lives to the Lord. Why don't you get some of your buddies and put their stories into a book, and we can print that, and then we'll have the inmates reading Prison Chains Broken. That's the name I like. With this book, God launched the literature ministry. 1993 to 1996 were very difficult years. You will remember Ernie had heart surgery. Unfortunately, after the surgery, they gave him 2 bags of blood. And in those bags of blood, they gave him the tainted blood with the hepatitis C virus. We did not realize he had been affected. So we always attributed his tiredness to his traveling. And till one morning, he had a esophagus varices, which was the blood coming up through the esophagus, and he had to be rushed to the hospital. The next 3 years was how many times do we have to call 911 and have him rushed in to have the blood sealed off in his esophagus and save his life. He had to cut down on his speaking engagements, and that was why we had to close Hebron Farm as well. Following Ernie's death in 1996, the director said, well, what are we going to do about Hebron Ministries? And I said, let's give it a month and let's see what God says. And in that month, we had a letter arrive from London, England, and they were asking us if they could take the Prison Chains Broken book and put it into Braille. So we thank the Lord for the first project of our new literature ministry program. Over the years, we have had many more books added to this list. Free at Last, then we got the next book, which was Drug Deals Delivered. Then we got the book There Is a Way Out, which is ladies' stories. And more recently, we have done Far and Wide, and it is a more multicultural book. Many of these books have gone into lots of different languages. Since Ernie's book was printed in 1982, it has gone into many languages. One of the doors that God opened was very unlikely. It was into Russia. And He gave us a connection that allowed us to send 150,000 books into Russia. And this connection was through Masters Foundation. And they printed that quantity of books and transported it and got it there, got it cleared, and the connection came, and they got it systematically placed through the prisons all across Russia, and they worked with the local people so that when those men actually would get out of prison, they would have the local people that they could make connection with. And we are revitalizing the Prison Chains Broken book, which is out of print, by putting it into an audiobook because it's a lot less expensive than printing it. We have also had one of those interviews that Ernie did with David Maines, and it has gone into 4 languages. We just thank the Lord that He's opening up this field to us. We are transitioning now into a new era for Hebron Ministries, and the book ministry is going to be moving to Moncton. And Cal Mascry from Harvest House Atlantic is going to become our book distributor. This is going to take a huge section of the work off of Sheila's shoulders and will allow her to devote her attention in other areas. And we thank God for providing this. Cal Mascry has a ministry down there where the men coming to his ministry heard about Hebron Ministries through the books. They came to Harvest House. Now they're in the recovery program, and now they are thrilled to be the people that will be sending the books back into the prisons to help other lives to be revolutionized.